Welcome to Echo Forge, dark fantasy and sci-fi stories from the edges of forgotten worlds. If you enjoy this kind of storytelling, hit like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you don't miss the next vision. Now, let's step through the gate.
Chapter 4. Leaning back in his chair, he exhaled, a slow breath that caught in his throat, as another surge in data knocked the power from the monitors before they flared back to life. A voice echoed in his mind, insistent, his own voice layered upon itself. It's all here. It's all here. The glitches weren't random, they were warnings. Or worse, a welcome. "You're talking to me," he said aloud, this time to the empty bay that answered with a low drone and a sudden bright spike in spectral interference. He bent over the console, scanning for something he could use to substantiate this creeping certainty. The room seemed to darken around the pulsing screens, as if the ship were contracting, concentrating its awareness entirely on this deepening enigma. His fingers hovered over the touch panel, hesitant, then confident. He drilled into streams of data logs, cross-checked against historical anomalies, and watched as every trajectory traced inward to this point in space. "A signal," he whispered, disbelief tinged with wonder. "You're sending me a damn signal." The ambient hum thickened, a surrounding presence that transformed sound into sensation, beating against his eardrums and bones. He pushed away from the console, rubbing his arms where the sound pressed into him like invisible hands. If this was a form of communication, it was unlike anything he'd encountered, a psychic and physical barrage. "You're trying to talk," he said to whatever intelligence had reached into the ship, into his very mind. But why? His own voice filled the small bay again, a lifeline cast into the uncertain void. "What do you want?" His demand was met with an abrupt, ear-splitting resonance that set every loose component in the bay vibrating like a plucked string. Then silence, as if something immense held its breath. "How do I know you're not a glitch, not some cosmic joke?" He stared down the silent, unblinking consoles. A moment passed, dense and unnerving, before the monitors relit with an almost violent flash. The same data, but this time every readout saturated, peaking in bursts that dwarfed earlier readings. A massive presence, an immense concentrated energy. He watched the numbers spiral upward, incredulous. His thoughts wove through fear and exhilaration, returning always to the same unthinkable conclusion. "I get it. You're the anomaly." Words fell from his lips with a new understanding, each one bait for whatever lurked in the unreadable depths. "You're aware. You know we're here." Yet, in this unimaginable encounter, a terrifying truth unfolded. His progress was the trigger, the very catalyst awakening an ancient, formidable consciousness. The ship shuddered as if in affirmation. He hesitated, then leapt to the console, opening the comm line to the navigation systems. "Reroute course," he ordered, his voice commanding despite the unease that gripped him. "Decrease speed." The room went darker, an unnatural eclipse that sucked energy from the lights and sounds. In the ensuing hush, he felt as if the entity considered his order with cold, indifferent calculation. Another wave of signal anomalies erupted, impossibly intense, transforming the ship into an echo chamber of jagged sounds and dizzying light. He staggered back, one hand clutching the console as the bay pulsed in sync with the ship's failing systems and the percussive drumming of his heart. In the face of this overwhelming intelligence, his human comprehension felt laughably fragile. Yet there it was, each heartbeat, each swell of energy, a testament to the alien persistence trying to reach him. He spoke through gritted teeth, challenging the very presence that threatened to consume him. "You think I'm afraid of you? Think again." But the trembling in his limbs and the pallor of his face betrayed his bravado. It was not fear alone that gnawed at him, but an unshakable sense of helplessness. The explorer sank into his chair, staring up at the monitors that wove a hypnotic pattern of colored static and urgency. A bleak resignation mingled with his growing understanding as the relentless rhythms echoed through him. He was no longer just an observer. He was the recipient of a message too vast, too alien to fully decipher. The command module was dark, expectant. Shadows swallowed the bulkheads, punctuated only by the faint flicker of status lights and the dull glow of a standby screen. The explorer sat, motionless, trying to still the unease that coursed through him. Then the flicker of light grew, resolving into a ghostly, half-formed presence. His former partner stood across the room, unnaturally bright against the dim backdrop. A gasp escaped him, followed by a taut whisper. "Who are you? What do you want?" Her features shimmered with a desperation he had seen once before. She leaned toward him, a distortion of light and memory as fragmented words tore through the silence. "Turn back. Danger." Her lips barely moved, yet the intensity of her plea hit like a physical blow. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the console, but he fought for composure, each word more forceful than the last. "Explain this message. What are you trying to tell me?" Her edges wavered, dissolved into static, but the intensity of the conversation, all taut silences and haunted tones, left the explorer grappling with the fearsome realization that he had received, not imagined, the entity's dire warning. He staggered up from his seat, the chair clattering away, and backed into the console, breath coming hard. The apparition blinked in and out, each time sharper, more accusing. Her eyes fixed on him with the kind of urgency that only old shared secrets can wield. "Why are you here?" he challenged, the words nearly swallowed by the shadows that wrapped around the room. The space that had once felt confined now felt limitless, filled with old echoes. The figure stepped forward, light passing through her in shimmers, and again the words pushed their way into him, inescapable. "You must leave." The desperate insistence in her tone reminded him of the last transmission they'd shared, of what it meant when her voice had sounded like this before. His mind raced through denial and belief, coming to rest on an understanding too painful to dismiss. "This isn't real," he asserted, trying to convince himself more than her. "You're gone. This isn't—" The effort was useless. His voice broke, and he stopped, ran a trembling hand over his face. The entity knew him well, far too well for comfort. It had reached inside his most fragile memories, and in doing so, made him question the very nature of reality. The apparition faltered, but didn't disappear. Instead, her gaze softened with what seemed like compassion, or pity, and again came the unbearable demand. "Turn back." She tilted her head, and her form fractured into pixelated bursts before reassembling with even greater clarity. Too late. The plea echoed like a living thing. The explorer, gripping the console as if to anchor himself in a sea of unreality, shouted back into the dark void of the module, "I need more than that. Tell me why. Tell me what I'm dealing with." He felt his voice hanging in the heavy air, raw and unsteady. The entity's silent responses shook him more than if she'd spoken. Still she endured. Her lips parted, soundlessly forming words. "Endangers. Everything." Each word was like a knife, sharp and cutting to the heart of what he feared. He wanted to reject it, to dismiss this as nothing more than another glitch, another spectre born of stress and isolation. But the precision of her presence, the knowing desperation of it, forbade denial. Silence choked the module as he fumbled for his next question. The moment stretched, nearly breaking him. Then, with newfound resolve, he spoke, his voice thick with the dual weight of loss and discovery. "Did you send the signals?" A fragment of movement, an almost imperceptible nod, confirmed the horrifying truth. He'd been seeking a mystery, a scientific revelation, and instead found this, a very personal haunting. His shoulders sagged as he absorbed the reality. What began as a calculated mission had spiraled into an encounter with the only part of his past he could not reconcile. He couldn't decide if this manifestation was an enemy or a savior, the beginning of something terrible or the end of everything. "Why now?" he whispered, more to himself than to the unblinking ghost. He glanced at her again, and her edges frayed, threatened dissolution. "Wait," he yelled, voice echoing off the metal surfaces, off his own fears. The apparition steadied, refusing to vanish as easily as he might have wished. There was no turning away from this, no simple return to scientific detachment. A flash of vivid light lit the module as a shower of sparks erupted from the console. The standby screen switched to full power, data scrolling faster than he could track. Still, the apparition stood unwavering in front of it. the chilling conviction of her message overshadowing all else. He pushed back against the realization bearing down on him, clenching his fists. "You were going to leave me with nothing," he accused, barely aware that he'd abandoned all pretense of denial, all semblance of disbelief. "Why should I trust you now?" The room absorbed the question, heavy with implications. But trust was no longer the issue. Survival was. His gaze met hers once more, and he saw the depth of her sincerity in that frozen moment. "Please," her voice fragmented, "live." This was no simple trick, no hallucination. It was a warning from a place he had long since buried. A final act from a presence both alien and heartbreakingly familiar. He fell back into the seat, defeated, yet clearer in purpose than before. She dissolved into static, then into nothing, leaving him to face the empty room, the lingering ghosts, and the very real threat that now felt closer, more immense than ever. Every part of him ached with the decision he knew he must make. He drew a shuddering breath and set his jaw, opening the comm line with more conviction than he thought he possessed. "Turn us around," he ordered, his voice firm, unyielding, full speed. The screen filled with rapid-fire metrics as the ship responded to the command. He watched, half expecting to see the apparition return, hoping, fearing, dreading it all at once. But she was gone, leaving only the stark and urgent truth of her warning. The module felt hollow without her, yet alive with the possibilities of choices not yet failed. His hands moved to silence the alarms blaring on the console. Each sound cut off was a reassurance that he'd caught the warning just in time. He scanned the growing distance on the monitors, one eye still on the corners where her presence had taken shape, as if he might catch another glimpse, one more indication of what awaited if he didn't heed her plea. "Maybe we'll both make it," he muttered, his words swallowed by the now humming machinery, the rhythm of the ship sinking again to his resolve. Or maybe he'd imagined it all. But imagination had never been this thorough, this persistent, and nothing else would have made him act so decisively. He leaned back, the faint traces of her still vivid against the backdrop of cold data. The universe outside was expansive, dark, uncharted, but the warnings from that space would haunt him long after he returned to its safe reaches. Her parting words etched into him as if they'd been delivered by his own hand, his own guilt. "Please, live." The ship pressed forward on its new course, leaving behind the bright anomaly of intelligence and its even brighter promise of disaster. As lights dimmed in the module and the clamor of warnings subsided, the explorer felt the depth of a second chance and the chilling weight of just how close it had come to being his last. The shadows kept him company. They stretched long and uncertain across the metal walls, puppets on invisible strings, moving in rhythm with the ship's subtle pulse. The explorer watched them from the corner of his eye, alone in the observatory, but for the monitor's dull hum. He leaned closer to the screens, soft white light casting a sterile halo, drowning out the bleakness of space beyond the observation port. Numbers, data, the comfort of calculable things. His breath clouded the surface as he muttered to himself and strained to keep calm. But there it was again. A presence, a question. He felt it before he saw, heard it before he knew. The explorer froze as it emerged from the air itself, shifting and shimmering, challenging everything he thought was solid. The room tilted with its presence. The explorer's eyes darted to the side, trying to anchor himself to something tangible. In a space defined by control, the unpredictable form was like a virus. It manifested with a fluidity that defied explanation, dissolving and reforming as if playing with its own existence. His instruments flickered, their readouts shifting in and out of coherence. "What are you?" His voice cut through the observatory, the sound of a man who preferred questions with answers. He leaned over the console, his gloved hand hovering, reluctant to touch what he could not understand. It felt like the room was listening, the very metal alive with attention. The entity responded in a way that challenged the sanity of logic. Silent yet loud, it bypassed language, projecting images that filled the explorer's mind with alien clarity. The sudden crash of cosmic debris, silent yet forceful, sent him staggering backward. He grasped the edge of the console as if holding on to the last piece of reality. More images, more chaos, a swirling void that devoured the known universe. a storm of light and darkness that hinted at imminent, unseen disaster. It forced him to confront each sequence with a mind split between scientific focus and primal fear. Is this the danger ahead? The explorer's voice shook, resonating with more than just sound. It was an echo of everything he didn't want to believe, every cautionary tale given form. The entity pulsed, filling the observatory with a cold, unearthly light. Its contours danced, vivid yet ungraspable, a question mark that wouldn't stop asking. The explorer's breath became visible, clouding in the sudden chill, his mind working to catch up with what his senses couldn't deny. He stared hard at his screens, toggling between the steady march of data and the relentless bombardment of vision. The rhythmic sound of his hand on the metallic switches echoed his growing desperation. He was a man used to finding answers in numbers, not in phantoms that bled into reality. Each panel he turned to seemed more obsolete, more inadequate in the face of what the entity laid bare. "I need more," he whispered, a plea to whatever logic might still exist. The entity obliged with a force that nearly brought him to his knees. Vivid and insistent, the projections intensified, an onslaught of cosmic debris and spatial tears rendered with terrifying precision. The explorer struggled to stay ahead of the narrative, racing against a story he didn't want to be a part of. His eyes narrowed as he clung to a thread of understanding. He traced each image with growing urgency, a map forming in his mind from the madness. The entity found its rhythm, its message distilled into crisp, coherent sequences. It was a cosmic dance, an imminent threat painted with strokes of light and shadow, its presence dominating the small, confined world of the observatory. "I understand," he said, the words emerging like an exhale of relief and resignation. "This is the threat, a cosmic anomaly that no human sensor can fully capture." The explorer stood closer to his console, recording the warning with the deliberate precision of a man who could afford no mistakes. Every detail, the tapping of his fingers, the intermittent hum of the ship, the persistent glow of the entity's light, built to a crescendo, a decisive moment caught between revelation and dread. He prepared to update his course, knowing the peril that lay ahead was as real as the chill in the room. The unyielding brilliance of the entity now imprinted on the fabric of his understanding. He became a part of the machine, a ghost in its wires, lost in its circuitry. The explorer's fingers danced over the switches, his thoughts keeping pace with the ship's electric pulse. Each panel lit with brief clarity, a silent dialogue between man and metal. It felt like progress, but the entity loomed, shifting and insistent, a haunting reminder that nothing was certain. The explorer stopped, his eyes darting between the spectral form and the data that raced across the screens. Was he closer to understanding, or just farther from what he knew? The entity kept pace, its presence a steady intrusion. He braced himself, letting it show him what his instruments couldn't. It responded with a force that challenged his very concept of clarity. No longer a disjointed vision, the projections coalesced into a grim tapestry, each thread woven with the urgency of a coming storm. The explorer flinched, then held steady, absorbing the silent roar of cosmic debris and the tidal pull of black voids. It was relentless, vivid, more real than the ship around him. A distortion of everything rational, an intrusion into the safe cocoon of his mind. "I see it," he muttered, almost as if convincing himself of the reality that the entity showed. He toggled the switches again, a frantic symphony of taps and clicks echoing the drumbeat of his heart. The screens blurred with data, his perception torn between the physical world and the phantoms that filled his vision. The phenomenon took shape, a monstrous spectre birthed from nothingness. The explorer's voice, once steady and deliberate, now strained against the enormity of what he faced. A cosmic anomaly, a threat, he insisted, trying to find the edges of something that refused to be contained. The entity flooded the observatory, an omnipresent reminder of his limits, of everything human perception couldn't yet grasp. It was inside him, through him, a cosmic parasite feeding on his ignorance and his stubborn need to know. He narrowed his eyes, determination eclipsing doubt. Each sequence gained precision, the cacophony of images giving way to a rhythmic cadence that etched a map into his mind. It became more than an act of observation. It was a communion, a surrender to the logic that the entity offered, a language written in the stars themselves. "This is it," he said, almost a whisper, almost a scream. A threat hidden in the darkness of space, an anomaly that no human sensor can capture. The words carried weight, as if spoken by someone who had glimpsed the divine, or perhaps the infernal. He stood close to his console, recording each image, each ghostly echo with the precision of a man who refused to be outpaced. The observatory thrummed with energy, with the pulse of urgency that matched the race of his thoughts. He prepared to adjust his course, the coordinates burning into his consciousness, the looming threat a scar across the map of his mind. The entity flickered with an intensity that suggested triumph or desperation. He couldn't tell which, but he knew he had no choice but to listen. Metallic clicks, the soft whir of recalibrating instruments, and the quiet yet relentless presence of the entity, these became his world. He imagined the enormity of what lay ahead, felt the press of it against the thin walls of his own resolve. "The anomaly," he said again, testing the weight of the words, the truth of them. He felt the observatory buzzing around him, an insect swarm of urgency and fear. "No human sensor," he repeated, a vow and a warning wrapped in a single breath. The explorer logged the threat with the determination of a man who had tasted clarity and knew how fleeting it could be. He was a message, a transmission encoded in flesh and thought, a prophet of the digital age burdened with revelations and their terrible implications. With the course updated, he lingered in the charged silence, a moment pregnant with the things he now understood, with the peril he now faced. The observatory seemed smaller, the walls creeping inward, the ship itself a fragile speck against the cosmic storm. And what of the entity? He considered its role, its purpose, the inscrutable agenda that drove it to communicate in the only way it could. He felt a strange kinship with the ghostly intelligence, a bond formed in the crucible of shared urgency. Was it benevolent? Was it cruel? The questions haunted him as surely as the spectral form itself. But for now, they were enough. The cold certainty, the ghost in the machine, and the impossible odds he was newly prepared to face. The explorer stood alone in the crowded silence of the control room, the walls closing in as he battled for a solution. Every breath echoed against the metal surfaces, and his fingers danced with a frantic grace over the interface, chasing answers through a sea of glitching data. The looming anomaly, a threat as certain as a gun to the head, cast its long shadow over the dimly lit space. Yet he pushed on. Hints of the entity's cryptic communication, shifting, translucent patterns, played like ghosts across the console, tugging at the corners of his vision with quiet urgency. He felt its presence everywhere, just out of reach, the phantom of its warnings daring him to understand. "Input alternate vector now," he demanded, the command ringing hollow in the claustrophobic void, as if the very ship conspired against him. The star map flickered in answer, each update a new betrayal, and the tension in his voice rose to meet the tempo of the indicator lights as they sputtered their maddening dance. He paused, swiping a hand through sweat-matted hair, a heartbeat of silence before launching into the chaos once more. "Fuel reserve calculations," he muttered to the ship, willing it to comply. But the numbers bled into one another, uncertain, illegible. His fingers resumed their relentless choreography, and the small of his back ached from bending over the stubborn interface. Reconfigure and update. Each command was clipped, an edge of fear gnawing at its resolve. The ship was an unyielding beast, and he was its frail master, locked in a struggle that stretched like a taut wire between determination and despair. The explorer keyed in a new sequence, eyes flickering over displays that hesitated before responding, their answers more mocking than reassuring. His throat tightened as the rerouted course rendered on the console, unreadable, hostile, the alternate vectors twisted in on themselves, trapped in the web of unreliable metrics, and he slammed his fist against the armrest, a small burst of frustration in the vast, uncaring silence. Everywhere he looked, systems misfired and diagnostics failed to clarify the situation. Life support readings blurred with navigation outputs, overlapping into uselessness. He knew the odds were closing in, a vice grip he could feel in the acceleration of his pulse, in the cold sweat on his neck. Full system diagnostic, he barked, watching as a fresh wave of errors blinked into existence, taunting his desperation with their indifference. Beyond the cracked logic of machinery, he sensed the looming presence that had haunted him through his journey. The anomaly, a devourer of matter and meaning, an end so total it left him breathless to imagine. He worked against the ticking of that clock, against the dark certainty that threatened to swallow everything he had dared to hope for. The ship seemed to strain and shudder around him, its tired components echoing his own exhaustion as he fought to find a path through the impending doom. As his mind grappled with options, the entity made its presence felt in the shimmer of unreality across the control display. The explorer blinked, confused as lines of projected routes faded into meaningless squiggles, overtaken by shifting patterns that grew bolder and more insistent. It was a language he couldn't fully translate, a communication that bypassed logic and went straight for the nerves. His skin prickled with awareness. He knew what it was, who it was, that turned the lights an eerie shade, that distorted the edges of his vision, but the meaning eluded him, even as it taunted from just beyond comprehension.
Thanks for watching Echo Forge. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe so the next tale finds you. Share this with someone who loves dark fantasy or twisted sci-fi, and I'll see you in the next world.